Behold, my servant shall act wisely. He shall be high and lifted up and shall be exalted. As many were astonished at you, his appearance was so marred beyond human semblance, and his form beyond that of the children of mankind, so shall he sprinkle many nations. Kings shall shut their mouths because of him, for that which has not been told them they see, and that which they have not heard they understand. Tonight is Good Friday. Good Friday is the day that we remember and commemorate the death of Jesus on the cross, which may cause you to wonder, why would you call that Good Friday when you're remembering the day that Jesus was tortured and killed? Well, it's because of what it accomplished. That's why we call it Good Friday. But what we're reading here in the book of Isaiah, you may not know this, and that's okay. I'm here to explain it to you. The Bible was not written all at once. It was not written all by the same author from start to finish. Each individual book was written at a different time and in a different place, and in general by a different author. So the book of Isaiah was written about 750 years before Christ. We are talking serious BC right here. Isaiah prophesied before the exile of the northern kingdom, if you're familiar with those events. But the reason I stress that to you, that this was 750 years beforehand, is because it makes the words that were written that much more important. Because this is a prophecy that was given. This was a foretelling of the future that was fulfilled by Jesus. And Isaiah is giving here one of either 4 or 5, depending on how you count it, what are called the servant songs. You may notice that the writing in front of you is broken up into poetic verse, because that is how the Hebrew is written. And it's talking about the servant of the Lord. And you might capitalize that because there are several places in the second half of Isaiah where God talks about his servant who is going to come. And this servant is understood to be a description of the Messiah. The Messiah is a word that means anointed one or promised one, the one who's going to come and deliver God's people. This goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 3:15, when God said he would send a descendant of the man and woman who would crush the head of the serpent. But he promises that this servant, this Messiah who will come, will be high and lifted up. And that just makes sense. If you talk about God's servant coming, he will be exalted. He will be lifted high. You can hear in the word exalt, you've got A-L-T, where we get words like altitude from. To be lifted up high above the rest of us. And this is exactly what Israel expected of their Messiah. They expected that not only would he be the exalted king, but thereby their nation would be exalted as well. Because shortly after Isaiah finished prophesying, the land of Israel was sent into exile. The northern kingdom was conquered by the Assyrian Empire, and the southern half of the kingdom was conquered by the Babylonian Empire, which was then given over to Persia, which was then given over to Greece, and after a very short period of independence was given over to the Romans, which is what happened around the time of Christ. So those who believed that Jesus was the Messiah believed that Jesus was there to get rid of Rome. That's what high and exalted is to them. But you see that the prophet here says, yes, he will be high and exalted, but he says in verse 14 that people will be astonished at him, that they will shut their mouths because of him, that they're not going to understand what they're seeing. God says, when I send my Messiah, when I send my servant to you, you are not going to be ready for what he's going to do. You will not expect or understand what will happen to him. It's going to astonish you. And what exactly about him is going to be so astonishing? It's said in verse 14, you can see how the text there has those dashes as it brackets part of what would be so astonishing. He says, his, meaning the servant's, appearance would be so marred. Marred, kids, means to be messed up, to be disfigured. Would be so marred beyond human semblance and form beyond that of the children of mankind. That means when my servant comes, God says, he is going to be so beaten, broken, and disfigured that if you were to look at him, you wouldn't even be sure if that was a man you were looking at or not. Now that's an astonishing thing for people to expect the promised one of God to come and then see him get ripped to pieces. That's astonishing. And people will not understand that. So we ask, what kind of king suffers like that? Well, he tells us right here at the beginning of this passage, when he says, so shall he, in verse 15, sprinkle many nations. Now that sounds weird to you and I, because when we hear the word sprinkle, we think of your favorite topping on a donut in the morning. But this is rather important. The word there is yazeh in Hebrew. And there are some that find this so odd, they've even sought to what's called emend the text, meaning change some of the lettering so that it actually would say, he will startle many nations. I'm not going to get into that debate. I'm just going to sit here and tell you the word that's in the Hebrew text is to, to sprinkle. And he will sprinkle many nations, which is significant because the word for nations in Hebrew is the word goyim, and it means the Gentiles. So this Messiah, this promised one of the Israelite God, is going to sprinkle the other nations. What's this all about? You got to think back to the book of Leviticus, chapter 16, where it describes the ceremonies of the Day of Atonement. When the priest would go into the Holy of Holies, the most holy room where the Ark of the Covenant was, he would take the blood of the sacrifice and sprinkle it over the mercy seat, as it was called. He would sprinkle it on the Ark of the Covenant. We always picture the Ark of the Covenant as a very shining golden thing. And it would have been when they first made it. But in fact, over the years, it would have become covered, stained, and encrusted with the blood of countless generations of sacrifice to represent what was being done there. So for a Hebrew to read this at this time, they would have known good and well what he meant by sprinkling many nations. That what this servant is going to do is not just to be exalted, he's going to be torn to pieces so that he can provide atonement to all nations. And that would astonish the world. And we know that this Savior, this servant that God prophesied about, is Jesus of Nazareth. The New Testament writers quote from this passage we're going to read tonight 7 times and attribute it to Jesus. And not only that, there are other places where it's called an allusion, meaning they will use a phrase from this passage to describe Jesus without directly quoting him. This was one of they understood to be the premier prophecies about Jesus. And so what we're talking about tonight is something happening to God's representative that is hard to believe, namely him dying on the cross. And that's the question for all of us tonight. Can you believe it? Can you believe what God has done through his servant? So those first 3 verses are kind of our introduction, and then we get into chapter 53, and we'll read 3 more verses, and he describes it in more detail. Who has believed? Who has believed what he's heard from us? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he, we're still talking about the servant here. For he grew up before him like a young plant, like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, and no beauty that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And as one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. Well, verse 1 of chapter 53 continues this theme, and he just says it again. No one's going to believe this. When you see this take place, what I'm prophesying right now, you're going to say, who has believed it? Who could imagine such a thing? John 12:38 and Romans 10:16 both quote that exact phrase in reference to Jesus' ministry. Who has believed our report? And what we have here, he's speaking in past tense. This is what's called the prophetic proleptic. It's a fancy word. Proleptic just means you're talking about a future event as if it's already happened. You with me on that? It's just talking about a future event in the past tense. Prophets did this all the time, okay? So he's describing what this servant, whom we believe to be Jesus, would be like. And it describes Jesus as being very unimpressive. That Jesus as a man had no form that we should look at him, no beauty that we should desire him, to grow up like a young plant, like a root out of dry ground. When you go to the botanical gardens, if you are that kind of person, you don't spend a lot of time looking up at the weeds growing up in between the cracks of the pavement. You spend time looking at the fully formed rose gardens, and you look at the hedges that have been trimmed and the rare plants brought over from wherever they brought it from. But they said Jesus is just like a root coming out of dry ground. There's nothing, you never look at Jesus and say, that's somebody I want to pay attention to. Casting crew would have looked him right over. Nope, you're not right for the part. It's not like Absalom from the Old Testament who said it was flawless from his head to his feet. It's not like the Adonis of the Greek legend that was so beautiful. Not this servant. But not only was he unimpressive, he would be, it says, despised and rejected. Do you see why he's saying you're going to be astonished by this guy? You expect my servant, who will be so exalted, to be somebody that everybody would look at and say, wow, he's so presidential. He looks like a king. No, not this one. Despised and rejected. He knew what it meant to be alone, to grieve, to be sorrowful. man from whom men hide their faces. You ever see somebody in public and you just try not to meet their eyes? You don't got to raise your hand. We all do it. Jesus was one of those men that you would look away from. Consider the story of Jesus, kids. Was Jesus somebody that people would look at and say, I want to be just like him? He was born to a virgin named Mary. And that's wonderful if you know the story, but if you don't believe it like most people did, what you see is a child who was born illegitimately out of wedlock and raised by a man who wasn't even his real father. He was born in a stable, not even in a hospital, not even in his own home. He was born in a place where they were leaving because they had to be taxed by these Romans. There was no one there to herald his birth except for these shepherds that nobody trusted or believed. When the king found out he had been born, King Herod had him hunted down and he was forced to flee. That's not an impressive birth. Then he comes back and he grows up in Nazareth. And the name of Nazareth is dear to us now. But one of Jesus' disciples, Nathanael, would say, can anything good come out of Nazareth? That's that place that nobody wanted to grow up. It was a rough town. He was a nobody. He was a carpenter. He was a day laborer is how you should get that. He worked from day to day. The carpenter, the stonemason, whatever it might have been. He was a nobody. And then when Jesus became somebody, when he became known, when he began to preach and do mighty miracles, he was rejected by everybody. He was rejected by the Pharisees. They plotted with the Herodians to kill him. He was rejected by his own leaders. He was rejected by his own religious teachers. He was rejected by his own family. The Bible tells us his own family did not even believe in him, and they tried to bring him home forcibly and restrain him because they thought he was out of his mind. And Jesus had his disciples and his followers, but there are several times in the New Testament where it tells us that the people spoke against Jesus or they stopped following Jesus, and he was left with only a small handful. We have a story in Matthew 13. Pardon me. Where it says Jesus came to his hometown. Now Jesus has been preaching everywhere. He's been preaching and people have been so impressed and, oh, this might be the king. But he comes to his hometown and he taught in their synagogue so that they were astonished and they said, where did this man get this wisdom and these mighty works? Is not this the carpenter's son? Is not his mother called Mary? And are not his brothers James and Joseph and Simon and Judas? And are not all his sisters with us? Where then did this man get all these things? Hear this now. And they took offense at him. And Jesus said, a prophet is not without honor, except in his own hometown and his own household. Jesus was received everywhere. Even if he wasn't believed everywhere, you came to hear Jesus. He goes back to his hometown, preaches there, and they were offended at this jumped up young buck who thought he was better than everybody. Jesus was rejected. He was despised his whole life. He had a few that followed him, but even they would abandon him at the end. And you consider even today, what do people think of Jesus? There are many people who think that Jesus was all right and have a soft opinion of him. But increasingly, you hear Jesus is called a bigot. He's a representative of all the things that are wrong with culture and everything that's wrong with the way we believe about things. And it's time for us to stop listening to Jesus and stop looking to saviors. And increasingly, if you're watching the media or if you're watching a movie or reading a book or playing a game, you'll see somebody that is deliberately framed as a Christ-like figure and portrayed as the villain. You see that. Some people just call Jesus a false teacher. The things that he said were wrong, that he was bringing a gospel that was not true and we should reject him and get away from it. Some people just say, like the people did in his day, he's a nobody. He might have been somebody then, but who cares? It's 2024 and I don't really care about Jesus. Everybody's got an opinion on Jesus, which is fulfilling exactly what Isaiah 53 prophesied. That Jesus would never be the kind of person that people are attracted to. Instead, he would be the kind of person that divides people. Jesus himself said, I did not come to bring peace. I came to bring a sword. And he's not talking about warfare. He's saying, I have come to be a divisive figure in the world. And that's what people do. They use Jesus as long as they need him. And then if they realize he's not a good vehicle for their purposes, they cast him to the side. It happens every day. And ultimately, the ultimate rejection, the ultimate lack of esteem, Jesus was abandoned by his disciples and sentenced to die by his own people. We continue in verse 4. Remember, we're speaking in the past tense, but it's intended as a future event. This is called proleptic writing, okay? Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions and crushed for our iniquities. Transgressions and iniquities are another words for sin, for wrongdoing. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned everyone to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him, that's the servant Isaiah is talking about, the iniquity of us all. Look at these words here. Grief, sorrow, pierced, crushed, chastised, wounded. You know, we use the word chastised today verbally, that you are chastised by somebody. But the old usage of that word, and as it is meant here, is to be beaten or publicly flogged. To be chastised is what that word means. You can see how it still takes on that tone verbally today. And that is exactly what happened to Jesus. You look at the story that we're going to read in due course tonight. Jesus was betrayed by one of his best friends by a kiss. I'll identify him to you by a kiss, which is the greeting of that culture. It's like, "Shalom, Rabbi," and the kiss on the cheek was how he identified him to his betrayers. He was falsely accused of saying that he would destroy the temple, of blaspheming Moses, of blaspheming God. Jesus was beaten. As the soldiers transported him from place to place, they punched him. They blinded his eyes and punched him in the face. They pulled at his beard. Eventually he was flogged. The Romans had something called a cat of nine tails, which was a whip that had leather straps hanging from it. And they would take pieces of bone or glass or rock or shell or sharp metal and embed them in the whip, so that as the lash came across his back and pulled back, those pieces of glass and metal would dig into his skin and rip the flesh off his back. Traditionally, they were given 39 lashes because 40 was considered too many, and it was an act of mercy, if you can believe it. Jesus was beaten by this. There were men that perished from the flogging alone. They also had these things called the fascisti. These were these wooden sticks. They were bound together. That's where the word fascism comes from, is binding everything together under one rod. And they would be taken apart and they would be used to beat people. And what they would sometimes do is they would beat you with the sticks first, because the sticks would not break the skin, but it would cause the swelling and the blood to rise to the surface, and there would be all manner of disfigurement in the back. Then they'd take the cat of nine tails, lash that across the back, and all the blood would be released all at once. Jesus' beard was pulled out. He was crowned with thorns and had a purple robe put on his back. Now imagine if your back has been laid open by a cat of nine tails and someone puts a fresh piece of cloth on your back. As the scabs harden and dry, and then before you get on that cross, that robe is ripped off your back one more time, and all the wounds are opened again. He was mocked. All this time, they weren't feeling bad for him, they were teasing him. Look at him now. He saved others. Why don't you save yourself, Jesus? His hands and his feet, nails were driven through to a piece of wood called a cross. And the writer talks about this. Our griefs, our sorrows, pierced, crushed, chastised. And he says, and we esteemed him stricken. Meaning, we see all that as a collective humanity. We look upon this man, see what happens to him. And our conclusion is, God has done this to him because he's done something wrong. We thought of him as getting exactly what he deserved. And yet he comes here and he says, all this was done for our transgressions, for our iniquities. These punishments that were supposed to be poured out on people who had committed crimes were poured out on one who had committed no crimes for our sake. And it is his wounds that bring healing to us. The Bible tells us very plainly what the penalty is for sin, iniquity, transgression, whatever you want to call it. Sometimes the Bible uses the word trespass to describe sin. You know what it means to trespass, don't you? It means to cross a line you're not supposed to cross. Well, let's apply that morally. That's called sin. All of our sins. We're all sinners because we all cross the line. And even if we don't, it's in us to do that. So what's the penalty? Well, God told us at the very beginning of time, Genesis 2, verse 17. The Lord told Adam and Eve, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it, you will surely die. Ezekiel 18, verse 4, the Lord said to Ezekiel, the soul who sins shall surely die. Romans 6:23 says, the wages of sin is death, meaning what you deserve for sin is death. Your paycheck after working a day as a sinner is death. And so what Jesus endured in that horrible, painful death on the cross is what you and I deserve for our sins, our rebellion against God. Because every one of us is a sinner. And many of us don't like that description. Christians are always so negative. They say that everybody's a sinner. They said everybody's done something wrong. Well, here's my response to you. Do you think that everyone's perfect? Because that's the alternative. The other alternative is to say there's no such thing as right and wrong. And I frankly just can't accept that. And I don't think you do either. Even if you do say so online or to sound brave in front of your friends. We all know that there is right and there is wrong. And we have committed wrong. Therefore, what is to be done? The Bible tells us the penalty for that is death. And not just death, death forever in a place called hell. You have introduced sin. You have introduced evil. You have spread the virus of wickedness in God's world. What is to be done? The Lord has warned us. It's eternal, conscious torment in a place called hell. So what did Jesus do? He says, I will take the penalty upon myself so that I can offer forgiveness to those who deserve this penalty. The world thought that Jesus was being punished. Did you catch that? We esteemed him smitten by God. Everybody that saw Jesus dying on the cross thought, well, that would never have happened to him if God didn't want it to happen. And they were right, but not in the way they thought. Because remember, as the Lord said at the beginning, nobody's going to believe this when it happens. Verse 7. Let's continue verse 7, 8, and 9 here. He was oppressed, the servant was, and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter. Whenever that phrase comes from? It comes from right here. And like a sheep that before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. And as for his generation, who considered that he was cut off out of the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people? And they made his grave with the wicked, and with a rich man in his death, although he had done no violence, and there was no deceit in his mouth. It describes what happened to the Savior, which is Jesus, twice as oppression. And that's exactly what it was. 3 different times Jesus was faced with 3 different governing or ruling authorities. And each time, although they could find nothing to condemn him, they condemned him anyway. The first time was at the hand of the Jews, the ruling council, the high priests, Annas and Caiaphas, who couldn't even get their witnesses to agree at what Jesus had done. It was an illegal trial in the middle of the night without the opportunity for Jesus to call witnesses, all of which should have caused them all to be stripped of their rank, yet they pushed on with it anyway. It would happen secondly to Herod, who was the ethnarch or the king of the area at that time. He was a descendant of Esau, and you could say he represents the other Semitic peoples in this way, who saw Jesus, tried to get Jesus to do some party tricks, turn a little water into wine for us. And when Jesus wouldn't say anything to him, Herod was offended and had him beaten and sent back to the third governing body, which was the Roman, the Gentile authority. And this was the harsh governor, Pontius Pilate, sent to Israel to bring them to heel after their many rebellions. And he said outright, I find no fault with this man. And he kept on trying to appease the crowd, first by having Jesus flogged, then by offering to release a different prisoner, until ultimately his cowardice got the better of him. And he ordered Jesus to be crucified. Yet through all of this, Jesus answered nothing. They had no case against him, and no one knew the law better than Jesus. He could have stood up, and he could have pronounced himself innocent, and yet he refused to do so. He took the punishment willingly. And everything that was said about Jesus in these verses happened 750 years later. That they made his grave with the wicked, taken away by affliction and oppression. He was crucified to assuage the crowd, even though there was no reason. He was crucified with the wicked, made his grave with the wicked. There were 2 thieves on either side of Jesus. What does that mean? We see the picture of the 3 crosses. The point is, Jesus' death was treated as just another execution by the Roman government. It wasn't special in their eyes. But he was crucified between 2 thieves, just like the other criminals. And then he was with the rich man in his death. The Bible tells us a man named Joseph of Arimathea, a rich man, offered to place Jesus in his own tomb after he came down off the cross. Everything that was prophesied about him came about. All of this is to demonstrate that Jesus was totally innocent, deserved none of it, had committed no crime. He was the Son of God, and yet he took it willingly. Another of the servant psalms in Isaiah 50, verse 6. This is the servant speaking now. Picture these words coming out of Jesus' mouth. I gave my back to those who strike, and my cheeks to those who pull out the beard. I hid not my face from disgrace and spitting. Jesus willingly did this. He even told his disciples, no one takes my life from me. I lay it down of my own accord. I have the authority to lay it down and to take it back up again. Why then? Why would he do this? Why would he willingly go through the most torturous death mankind has invented? Why would he take not just that, but the shame and the blame and the false accusation? Who is this guy? We see it come to a conclusion in verse 10. Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him. He, meaning God, has put him to grief. And when his soul makes an offering for guilt, he shall see his offspring. He shall prolong his days. The will of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. Out of the anguish of his soul he shall see and be satisfied. By his knowledge shall the righteous one, my servant, make many to be accounted righteous, and he shall bear their iniquities. Therefore I will divide him a portion with the many, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out his soul to death and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he bore the sin of many and makes intercession for the transgressors. Here's the amazing bit. After everything we just read and the righteous anger that rises in your heart when you hear about this, this was God's plan. God did this. All along it was the plan to crush him as an offering for guilt. So while you could lay blame at the Jews, and you could lay blame at Herod and his court, and you could lay blame at the Romans, and indeed all of us, ultimately it was the will of God to do this to Jesus as an offering for guilt. What did we read at the very beginning that made us cock our heads a little bit? So that he could sprinkle many nations to cover the broken law with the shed blood of Jesus. What we needed so that we could approach God. As God prophesied in Genesis 3:15, the Son of Woman will crush the serpent's head, but the serpent will bruise his heel. There will be an affliction. There will be a pain that comes upon the Son. But in so doing, he will crush the head of sin and wickedness forever. This is the ultimate example of love. Jesus saying, I will die so that you can live. So that you can live forever. One man laid down his life willingly, unfairly, and gave himself up to those who struck him. And you can see in this passage also, there is just a little hint of the resurrection prophesied here too. We've described the crushing and the destruction and the death of this man as a sacrifice. But verse 10, he shall prolong his days, and he will see his offspring. Meaning even though he's been crushed and there's nothing left, there is a future for this servant, which is exactly what we believe. And who are his offspring? Jesus had no children. Don't believe everything you see on TV, okay? We are his offspring. Those who have believed in Christ, who have come to him for salvation. Those are those that are brought in to God's house by the blood of Jesus. And we shall see his favor forever and ever if we believe. And as you see in verse 11, by his knowledge shall the righteous one, my servant, make many to be accounted righteous. Meaning you will be placed in the column of righteous, even though you yourself are a sinner, because he will bear their iniquities. To know him, therefore, is to come to Christ and say, God, may Jesus' sacrifice count for mine. I pledge my life to him. Everything you say that has been done, I need that. Because I am so racked with guilt, I can barely get out of bed in the morning. And the jokes, and the laughter, and the drugs, and the alcohol, and the anger all covers it for a time. But when I'm all by myself, I know what I am. And if there's forgiveness to be had, if there's eternal life to be had, I need that. And that's why the death of Jesus makes for a Good Friday indeed. Philippians 2, verses 8 through 11. Paul, the apostle, writes, Jesus humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Therefore God has highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name that is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow, in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. The confession, that acknowledgement that Jesus is Lord, King, Master, ruler of all. And I pledge my life and my soul to him. By being numbered with the sinners, Jesus bore our sin and makes intercession for us now. What does intercession mean? It means to go between. It means to put in a good word for. He stands in between the wrath of God and your need for forgiveness so that he can offer it to you. They were so wrong about Jesus. All of us were so wrong. That's why the writer started it by saying, yeah, my king is coming and he will be exalted, but you're not ready for what he's about to do. And most people are not. You may be wrong about Jesus even today. I heard someone not long ago on the internet describing, in an attempt to mock Christians, like, don't you know what the cross is? Don't you know that it's an instrument of torture? Don't you know that people bled and died on those things? It's kind of sick for you to carry that. Yeah, we know where you've been. That's the whole point. This is what I deserve, and Jesus did it for me. Therefore, that implement of death and destruction, as we sing, has a wondrous attraction for me. For on that cross, Jesus bled and died to pardon and sanctify me. Jesus is Lord and King, and the only sacrifice that is available for sin. Your sin needs to be paid for. You have a choice. You can pay that penalty yourself forever in a place called hell, or you could ask the Lord to count Jesus' sacrifice for you. And if you will place your faith and as an act of your will believe and submit to Jesus, then he will count you righteous and a whole new world.